Okay, we are now live streaming on Facebook. Thank you to all of you around the world who are with us on the Spirituality and Practice page. I know that we have many countries represented and lots of folks who know spiritualityandpractice.com and perhaps some who do not and who are here simply because of our guest. Our guest is Brian McLaren. Brian is the author of, it's not showing up very well, is it? Do I Stay Christian? And this is publication day, isn't it, Brian?
That's right. Yes, as we speak.
I imagine this is kind of an unusual publication day. You're probably spending it in your home study there rather than giving some big talk on the road and doing the kinds of things that you used to do.
That's very true. Things have changed since COVID, and I must say it is harder to get back on airplanes than ever. So we all complain about Zoom and so on, but man, it's got some great advantages too. So it's a good thing.
Well, why don't we kick right off? I have a bunch of questions, but why don't we kick right off with you telling us what your book is about? I mean, I know the answer to this already because I've read it. But tell us what the book is about and who is it for?
Well, one way to say it, John, is that in the United States right now, and of course, different countries that have their own numbers, but there are somewhere around 70 million adults who grew up going to church but no longer do. That's a lot. And that number grows by somewhere between 2.5 and 3 million a year, maybe even a little more now. And there are all kinds of reasons for that. But the point is that at any given moment, an awful lot of people who grew up Christian are wondering if that's something they want to stick with. They see it maybe doing harm to themselves. They see it doing harm to others. They wonder who gets to define what it is, because depending on who defines it, they have to decide whether they fit that definition or not. So this struggle of religious identity, it's been a struggle in my life. And I was a pastor for 24 years. In recent years, I've been surprised how many clergy are also really struggling with not just whether they stay in ministry, but they're having all kinds of mixed feelings about Christian faith. So this is a book that is not trying to tell people you better stay Christian or bad things will happen to you or something like that. It's a book that's trying to help people think through that question in a morally responsible way.
As I was making some notes yesterday with questions I wanted to be sure to ask you, I started to reflect on the last time I've been with you. I was with you in person, and I think it was 9 years ago. We were both at a conference in Memphis with our mutual friend, Phyllis Tickle.
Yes, and can I just say thanks again for your great biographical work on her? Oh,
well, thank you. But I was thinking, that suddenly struck me as being a good question to ask you. Is this, you've moved through a lot of movements. You've traveled a lot of the world. You have occupied your intellectual space and teaching ministry, if you still call it that, with a variety of different things over the last decade, which is very interesting to me, and I imagine it might be interesting to others. Can you reflect for a moment on where were you 10 years ago? I mean, Brian McLaren 10 years ago, at least to me, was still primarily, in our relatively small part of the world, famous for a book called Generous Orthodoxy, which became a phrase used, all over the world to good effect. And thank you to Brian McLaren for that. But that great paperback from 2006 with the subtitle that covered the whole front cover. I mean, that's who I think a lot of people knew you for 10 years ago. And you were traveling all over the world in a movement that no longer really exists. And how has that gone? How have you gone from that place to where you are now writing Do I Stay Christian?
Yes. Well, a lot to work with there, John. So this will keep us going for hours, I think. So let me do a very short version because it's such a thoughtful question. So when you and I were together with Phyllis Tickle, Phyllis, actually, when that book, Generous Orthodoxy, came out, was one of the people who was responsible for its success because she told a lot of people it was worth reading. And she was a person in the publishing world and in the Christian world that people paid attention to. And what I was really arguing for there was that there are treasures in each of our traditions and there are problems in each of our traditions. And here I was just thinking about Christian traditions, from charismatic to Catholic to Baptist to Calvinist and to Mennonite to Eastern Orthodox and everything in between. And there are treasures, but there are also problems. And can we start sorting that through? And maybe what we're allowed to do is try to find the treasures across the board and bring those together, and find the problems and face those and acknowledge those and learn from our mistakes. And could there be a way that we move forward together? I don't really think that's changed at all in my thinking through the years. That really has been a huge part of my focus. And I should say, I shouldn't take credit for that term, generous orthodoxy, because a theologian named Hans Frey was the first person I think I knew of who used it. And then a lot of other people have used it. Maybe I helped popularize it. But when I and others started talking about this in the late 90s and early 2000s, a term grew up. We talked about an emerging conversation about emerging forms of Christianity. And we had a critical decision to make. In the religious world, branding is a big deal. And we self-consciously said, we want to keep a conversation going, but we don't want to try to own a brand on anything. And we weren't really interested in creating a competing brand, to compete against the other brands. Our real desire was to see a conversation happen among Roman Catholics, among evangelicals, among mainline Protestants, and others. So that conversation continues, and this book is an important milestone for me in that conversation. And I suppose the thing over the last 10 years that happened, that marks a huge turning point in this, is when somewhere around 80% of white evangelicals, somewhere around between 50 and 60% of white Roman Catholics and others lined up in support of Donald Trump, no matter how many lies he told, and no matter how many threats he made, and no matter how many, kind of narcissistic and juvenile, even feels like an insult to juveniles, but just immature behaviors that he would demonstrate, that there was this deep attraction. And also in these last 10 years, and I should say, and that sort of partnership between an immoral man and people who were identified as Christians, that was so passionate and deep and longstanding, taken together with simultaneously in the Roman Catholic Church, more news of scandalous behavior among priests and especially the bishops who covered up. And then just this week, the Southern Baptists having an almost identical scandal emerge, while these same religious leaders are shaming other people for very often sexual behavior, along with any number of other megachurches and megachurch leaders who, if it's not a problem with sex, it's a problem with abuse of power or abuse of money. There's just been this sense that the wheels are falling off something. And I think it's intensifying the religious identity struggle that a lot of us have.
Well, and speaking of that, a big part of your audience who I know you want to reach and who I'm sure you are going to reach with Do I Stay Christian is the audience of those who have left the church and who might be returning, or those who have recently left the church or who are thinking of leaving the church and who might be considering returning. You are, a third career person, right? You were a college professor, you were a pastor for a long time, and then you've been a public theologian and an author of books, and that's sort of your third career. And I see the guitars on the wall, you play the guitar on the side, right? But my question is, have you ever been someone who left the church and returned? Is this at all your story?
So I tell a story in the book about when I was a pastor. I had deep questions and doubts and reservations. And I very tentatively would try to bring them up. I didn't want to be a fraud. I didn't want to advertise something that wasn't true of me. So I tried to be honest about my questions. And at some early on, I mean, I only dared to express some relatively superficial, surface level questions. But as time went on, those questions became deeper. And I went through a remarkable moment. Not many pastors can go through this moment, but where several of the leaders of my church, first one came to me and said, look, I think our congregation needs to decide if this journey that you're on is your journey alone or if it's our journey too. And I was threatened by that because I thought, gosh, I'm going to lose my job if we bring this question forward. But this friend brought it forward and on a retreat of the leaders of our congregation. And really, to my surprise, the sense in the room was, this is not just Brian's question, this is our question. We're all struggling with elements of our Christian identity. So let's go on this journey together. So I was incredibly fortunate that I didn't have to keep that a secret, or that I didn't lose my job as a result. So I was a pastor for 24 years. I left the pastorate. I moved down here to Florida, where I now live, from living in the DC area. And for the first time in my life, I had a choice about whether I would go to church. I wasn't getting paid to go after a long time of getting paid. And I did indeed feel I wanted to keep going to church for a whole lot of reasons. But I have to admit that it just feels, because of the complexity of these times, the decision to go to church, to be part of a faith community, that's one set of decisions. But because the word Christian can now mean absolutely opposite things, I think I continue to feel the pain of that. I'll just say one other thing about this, Jon. The first third of the book, I talk about some of the main reasons people leave Christianity, and there are huge issues in our history that are relatively unacknowledged and to very, very many Christians unknown. And in fact, reading those chapters will be very disturbing to some people, because these are just elements of our history that a lot of people literally have never heard about. And I suppose here's my concern. I think the worst things that the Christian religion is ever responsible for could be in the next 10 years or in the next 20 years. And so that's another reason that I think, and this creates an intensity both ways. Some people just say, yeah, I want out before this thing gets any worse. And other people say, well, if I have a footprint here, don't I have a responsibility to try to use whatever power and voice I have to make a positive difference to keep those terrible potential things from happening?
Well, speaking of those worst aspects of Christianity, you begin the book in part 1 with 10 chapters, each one addressing one of those lousy aspects of Christianity, Christendom, or the Christian faith, or Christians.
Yeah. And
I'll admit that when I first picked up the book, started to read it, looked at the table of contents and started to read it, I thought, oh, I'm not so sure I want to rehearse those things.
Yes.
I almost wish we could just acknowledge that there's all of this lousiness and then get to the stuff that Brian's going to tell me that's going to give me some kind of hope. But why did you want to do that in part 1? Why begin that way?
Well, one of the blessings of my life, Jon, when I was a pastor, is that we had a huge influx of people from the recovery community. So I was always getting invited to anniversaries at Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous. And I was invited to give talks and lead retreats. And so I got immersed into this amazing community. And one of the 12 steps is that part of our recovery from harmful behaviors involves going through a searching and fearless moral inventory. In other words, if I found out that I'm capable of some pretty shabby behavior and I really want to make a change, the answer to that is not to just shut the door on the past, but to actually go back and rehearse the past, and where necessary, make amends. And that act of facing the past and wherever I can making amends is one of the things that helps me change, so that the me who goes forward is deeply different from the me who has done a lot of harm and pain in the past because of my addiction or because of a whole set of religious and spiritual problems. And so that's why I feel for the people who are going to stay, I think they'd better stay with their eyes open and having gone through that kind of searching and fearless moral inventory. I think we feel this because of recent headlines where religious leaders who were shaming other people for their sexual behavior were keeping secrets about other leaders in their group and their own sexual behavior. So this sense that, the danger of hypocrisy is there for all of us. And I think the changes that we need to keep us from being more dangerous going forward require that honesty. And then that's probably a good place to stop. And yeah, maybe I could say it this way: I'm staying a Christian. If other people want to stay Christians, I think we better do it with our eyes open, so that we will help our faith communities to be different in the future than we've been in the past.
Yeah, I think that's well put. In part 2, you then have 10 chapters of reasons to stay. And I want to give you an opportunity in your answer to mention a few of them, but I want to pose my question by saying, I was surprised that one of the 10 was not the reason that I hear most often from friends who make similar arguments as to why they remain in the church or why they remain Christian, which is, I often have friends who say all the things that Christians do that are good, but look at all the good that Christians do, and then these things can be chronicled. That wasn't one of the 10 chapters. So that's my 2-part question is, tell us a little bit, what are some of those 10 so that people hear a few of them, but also why wasn't one of them, but look at all the good that we do. We may do these lousy things, but look at these good things we do.
Yes. Well, I'm really glad you bring that up. Let me address that first, and then I'll come to the larger second part of the book. The place I dismiss that somewhat playfully, and maybe too hastily, I don't know. But at the beginning of a chapter in that section, where I have a conversation, obviously in a playful sort of spirit, with my inner fundamentalist. And I say that, look, I grew up in a fundamentalist setting. And even though I've left fundamentalism, there's a part of fundamentalism that's embedded in my brain. And I have, friends from different faith traditions who say, yeah, I've got my version of that too. And so I have my inner fundamentalist bring that up and say, what about all the good that people are doing? And then I dismiss that by saying, you sound like the abusive spouse who says, I've given you diamond rings, I've taken you on expensive vacations, I've taken you to the best restaurants. What's a few bruises and broken bones? There's a part of that kind of argument that I think is sincere, but that people don't realize how it ends up enabling an awful lot of harm. Maybe I could say it like this. In one of the chapters, I talk about something I call religious company men. This is in the first 10 chapters. And one of the things that I say there is that all of the wonderful ministers doing good without ever meaning to end up providing cover for these other people who do some pretty terrible things. So there's a certain sense that if we only focus on the good, we're ending up unintentionally empowering. We're letting people off the hook, and we're letting systems off the hook that need to be addressed. I guess that would be it. So in that section, the middle chapter in that section is because of our legendary founder. And I think for an awful lot of us, and this is certainly true for me, I actually, like, the older I get, the more I study, the more I learn, the more questions I ask, I end up being more impressed with Jesus as a person rather than less. Like, there's an awful lot of mystique I've lost about a lot of things in life. But my gosh, the mystique about Jesus just grows, it never stops. I mean, I just, something I've said the Lord's Prayer how many thousand times in my life. And when I stop to think about it, I just think this is a revolutionary set of ideas that Jesus is embedding in people's brains. Or just recently, I was asked to preach on the Beatitudes, the beginning of Jesus' longest discourse that we have in the New Testament. And these 8 or 9, depending on how you count them, Beatitudes, they just are, to me, like they're revolutionary when you don't just read them as a greeting card sentiment, but you say, what if this is kind of a political and social agenda that's being spread here? Oh my gosh, it's profound. One of the really important themes that comes up in the second part is the problem of innocence, the quest for innocence. A lot of people, and I think a lot of the dysfunctions in religion have to do with the fact that we feel guilt and shame, and religion often becomes a kind of innocence market. You do this, you pray this, you say this, and we'll confer innocence upon you. And it's like a shortcut to innocence. And I say in the book that I'm suspicious about shortcuts, very often that's a way of saying, I'd like to cheat my way to innocence. And I talk about how innocence very often involves sucking innocence out of victims who we think we gain their innocence by defending them or siding with them. And then we think we bolster our innocence by finding some villain that oppresses those victims who we can hate and attack. And that makes us feel, and there's just an insidious kind of addictive nature to this quest for innocence. And the irony is, this is what repels a lot of people from religion. But ironically, you can play into the same game in leaving. Those Christians are dirty hypocrites. I don't want my ego to be sullied by association with them. And it becomes another quest for innocence. And so I do some reflection on, is there another way out of our shame and guilt than in a kind of desperate Hail Mary pass, pardon that phrase, but for innocence.
Well, I have to ask, though, why organized or formal religion at all? I mean, why not just a non-specific spiritual path and leave all the religious people to go and fight with each other?
Yeah. Well, when it comes to Christianity, first of all, that's a very good question. And I think a lot of people, that's what they will choose, is a sort of unidentified spiritual path. And I don't condemn anybody for doing that. I think there are reasons to do that. But if someone were to say, do you see any potential downsides in that? I'd say a couple. Again, this is not to say it's the wrong decision, but just as I want people to have their eyes open if they stay Christian, it's good to have your eyes open if you take other options. And one of them is that the Christian religion is the largest religion in the world, about a third of the world's people. By far, the Christians own more wealth than any other single religious group. And by far, Christians have access to more of the world's most dangerous weapons. And so if Christianity goes bad, it doesn't matter what religion you are, you're going to suffer the consequences. So, and if Christianity and Islam decide they want to go to war with each other, now we have over 50% of the world's population. Everybody suffers. There's an old Buddhist saying, when the elephants fight, the grass suffers most. And so when the big, organized religious communities fight, everybody suffers. So that's the first thing I'd say, is that the institution doesn't go away when you leave it. And so that's something to take into account. Secondly, institutions, I'm an advocate for a complex relationship to institutions. Some people are blind institutionalists, although I don't think anybody would ever admit that. Some people would be happy to admit that they're anti-institutionalists. They just want to burn them all down because they see nothing but corruption and trouble. I personally see that institutions and social movements have a kind of yin-yang dynamic relationship. The way I say it is that social movements push for moral gains, and institutions preserve the moral gains made by past movements. And what that means is those institutions are so busy conserving the gains made by past movements that when a new progressive proposal comes along, they generally feel their hands are too full to take on anything else. And so they sort of push it away. So I am a believer that if you burn down an institution, you're going to have to create a new one, and there's no guarantee that you won't have more trouble in between here and there. And so institutions either self-destruct or are destroyed, or they have to find ways to be renewed. So I'm not anti-institutional. That's the second thing. And then the third thing I'd say is that the treasures that are conserved by those institutions usually are considerable. And often they're not obvious. In other words, like some animal that occupies an ecosystem, it might go extinct and we don't immediately realize the effects of it disappearing from the landscape. And there are great treasures. And I believe that's true of Christianity, that's true of Judaism, Islam, Sikhism, Buddhism, Taoism, whatever. There are treasures. And it's, I think, our job to appreciate those treasures and try to preserve them. And so any talk of burn the forest down is not to me is not, it's an understandable response of anger and frustration. It's absolutely understandable, but I don't think it's a wise thing long term.
Are there 2 or 3 questions that you find yourself asking people that you encounter frequently, I'm sure, who say to you, I left the church, last year, or I don't think I'm going back, or I'm done with church? Yeah. Are there a couple of questions that you often ask first?
That's a good question. I mean, usually I just want to hear, because what I hear in that is an expression of pain. I'd say 95% of the time, what I'm hearing is an expression of pain. And there's a story of suffering. So I just want to hear their story. I'm really interested in their story. I have a lot to learn from that. And then I can try to respond, not by minimizing the harm that was done to them, but by empathizing as a human being and trying to feel their pain and just be a witness to their pain. And honestly, that feels like the most important thing I can do. If I can say it this way, to me, the most Christian thing I can do is be a witness to their pain, not try to defend the institutions or people or doctrines that have hurt them, right? That just feels to me like a shabby way to respond. I'm often interested, what are you doing now? Like, what is your life like now? You don't want to be part of that. And very often a person's honest answer is, look, I'm just trying to recover. I'm just trying to stay away from it. I'm trying to keep it off my social media because I've been traumatized and I don't need to be re-traumatized. And so very often that's what people tell me. But often what people are doing is they're pursuing beautiful and good things. I was just on a podcast the other night with 2 guys who used to be ministers in Australia in a famous church called Hillsong that just has become sort of infamous for some of their own, internal problems and mistakes and crimes in some cases. And so they have now left ministry and they've left Christianity, they've left religion. But what are they doing? They're doing a podcast to try to help other people who've been along the path they are, who've been wounded and damaged by religion. And so they had me on the podcast, even though I'm not ending up where they're ending up. I think their preference, they would have been happier maybe if I'd been on there to say, yeah, I'm an atheist now and I don't believe in any of this. But they realized that my book is going to help some people that they're not going to be able to help. So they wanted to have me on. So to me, you start to find out that people are trying to do, very often, they're not just trying to recover, they're actually trying to do some harm reduction and some healing wherever they can.
Well, and don't you think for a lot of people, the best thing that can happen is a period of time in their life where they stop trying to be spiritual or stop trying to be religious?
Oh my gosh, especially when we take seriously the treadmills of shame and a desperate plea, a desperate ploy for innocence, and how much activity is done to try to impress some religious leader, and then you think of how even the word God gets into very prime and very sensitive real estate in our brain, and ends up just, I imagine a neurologist watching our nervous system whenever the word God gets said, and all of the anxiety that produces for some people. You can see why, just like somebody who has been drinking way too much coffee needs to detox, decaffeinate for a while. Yeah, there are people who are just so set on edge. They really need relief. And in fact, this has been, it's something I was very happy I got to write about in this book, because I've wanted to write about this for 15 or 20 years. That I just think, this book is about the word Christianity, but I think we face a similar set of problems with the word God, because the word has become, well, it can mean opposite things. It can mean absolutely opposite things. And so we all use the same word. And one of us is thinking how the word God justifies killing other people or shaming other people or driving other people out of your country. And other people think the word means taking a person into your home who's in need and pouring out yourself in love for others. So this is a problem we face. But you know what? It's not just in religion. You say the word America, you pick up a flag, and they're every bit as contested, precious, dangerous, noble, vile as religious struggles we're having.
Well, and speaking of the way that you define terms, I like how you refer to religion or each religious tradition as its gift is showing people a way to a more mature humanity. I think that's your phrase. I like that. I mean, can you explain what that is for people?
Sure. It's funny. I was a pastor for 24 years, as you said, and I've been doing this writing work for, 20 years. And so this has been, my life's work in many ways. And I feel like just now in my mid 60s, I'm getting a little bit of clarity on what religion is and what religion does. and at its best, it seems to me, when you look back over history, people would be in a mess. And at its best, religion would help them develop the practices to get to the next level of maturity, and to conserve, to hold, to keep from sliding back. But then at its best, to actually move to a next stage or level of maturity. And we as a human race know right now that our current level of maturity is insufficient to meet the existential challenges we have. Like we are in the first time in human history, we have an economic system that is very efficient at producing prosperity short term, but it's producing long-term devastation in the form of climate change, ecological overshoot, all of the ecological crises we're in. How in the heck are we going to get out of that mess? How are we going to get out of that mess if it doesn't involve more maturity? And that maturity, somebody has to curate, somebody has to envision it, somebody has to develop practices that develop it, rituals that celebrate it, coming of age, rites of passage that help us celebrate milestones of it. Somebody has to do that. I don't think a profit motive business is going to do it. I don't think politicians who find themselves captive to money and power are going to do it. And for all of the problems in religion, I think even the most adamant atheist has to hope that religion can start making this unique and needed contribution at a global scale very, very soon.
Yeah, thank you. We are. I should say we are talking with Brian McLaren on publication day of his new book, Do I Stay Christian? Thanks for being with us at spiritualityandpractice.com. And if you have questions, shoot them to us. We have 2 or 3 or more. I see them coming in. So Brian, let me ask you, we have maybe 10 minutes left. Let me ask a few of these questions from people.
Yes.
One of them is from John, and he says, truly progressive Christian churches seem to be few and far between. How can we change that?
Yeah, John, thanks for that question. And I think you're right. There are a lot more churches that think they're progressive because they're not fundamentalist. And I think they're right about not being fundamentalist, but very often I think they're saying, we've been this way since the 1960s. Well, things have changed since the 1960s. So I think, and especially for those of us who are the descendants of the colonizers, whether we're in the US or Europe or wherever we are, we have to realize that terms like conservative and liberal or progressive were two wings of colonial forms of Christianity. And I think we're only at the beginning of realizing how deep the roots of the colonial mindset, the mindset of domination and expansion, and a mindset that's deeply influenced by certain views of money and wealth and deep views about race and supremacy. We're just at the beginning of even imagining what that would be. And so I would say that the reason that we see so few truly progressive churches is because we're still in the disembedding process of a whole lot of assumptions. And even though one group might be a little farther ahead than another group and be tempted to feel superior, if that group actually starts looking instead of how far they've come at how far we have to go, I think they'll return to humility and feel this long journey we're on is really, really important. Just to give a framework for this, I refer to the work of Ilia Delio, a brilliant Franciscan nun and theologian who builds on the work of Ewart Cousins and Taylor Desjardins and others, who speak of what we're going through right now as a third axial age, a global reordering of the way we human beings wire our brains. And the fact that that's difficult and the fact that it doesn't happen overnight shouldn't surprise us. And I don't say that to tell people, so just relax. No, I feel urgency about this. This is hard work. It's necessary work. And, but I think we shouldn't be surprised that it's slow going and there's an awful lot of headwinds working against it, both inside the world of religion and in our cultures at large.
There's several more questions. I'm going to read two of them at once. They are not the same question, but I want to get them said out loud. Alice says, why is it so difficult to find progressive fourth stage churches while it seems the far right continues to grow these mega churches with frightening dogma? And Janet says, why has the church gotten away from spiritual practices?
Okay, well, two fantastic questions, and really they're related. The first question is referring to a framework I explain in Do I Stay Christian that my previous book was primarily about, where I offer a synthesis of a lot of different models of stages of spiritual formation, human spiritual development. And so the problem is, and this really builds off this last question, we human beings have millennia of experience in what I call stage one, or simplicity, which is a stage where we're oriented toward easy, yes, no, us, them, friend, enemy, in, out, good, bad, dualisms, and the authority figures that enforce them. And then more and more of us are beginning to move into stage two, which is more pragmatic, and it's interested in results and effectiveness. And by the way, I think the megachurch phenomenon has been so popular here in the United States, especially because we had a big backlog of people who were ready to grow out of stage one. And in many ways, megachurches became a stage two, what I call complexity way of being a Christian. And we just are at the beginning stages of grappling with stage three and stage four. And when it comes to stage four, which is the stage of, I call it harmony or solidarity, where we begin to appreciate people of all different backgrounds, and we don't need to divide the world into us and them, but we realize we're all part of this one larger us, and that us doesn't stop with human beings, but extends to animals and plants and ecosystems, because we ultimately have this deep experience of connectedness and unity. We have such a desperate need for those kinds of faith communities to form, and when they form, just as this question insightfully assumes, they will put into the center practices that help us not just have ideas in our head, but have a way of being in our entire bodies, in our emotions, in our mind, in our habits, our reactions. And this will be, for all of us who've ventured into this territory, we know how meaningful and how rewarding it is. And I suppose this is some words from Jesus come to mind, where he talked about let your light shine. Those of us who are moving into this space have to let our light shine, and not just complain about how bad those other people are, how problematic they are, but actually let people see our joy and our hope and our vision and what we're learning and experiencing. That's how the change continues to spread.
Betty asks a big question. How do you heal trauma from Christianity while staying in Christianity?
Yes.
How do you address that in the book, Brian?
Yes, Betty. So I should say the healing of trauma is something that's sort of underlying this whole book. But there are people who are specializing in this because we're coming to see how serious a problem it is. I think of a young fellow who wrote his doctoral dissertation on my work, and was from a fundamentalist Christian background, and has since become, I think, identifies as an atheist now. But he's devoted his life to the development of a scholarly field of religious trauma. And this is happening in psychology. It's happening in theology. It's just fascinating to watch this. It feels like we're at the frontier of a whole science of the way that religious trauma works. And I suppose what I would say to folks who feel, yes, that's me, I'm being re-traumatized, maybe even by being in this conversation makes people feel like, oh gosh, I'm getting too close to stuff that I want to get away from. I mean, those are signs that we've been traumatized. The thing I would say is you're not alone. Millions of us are coming to terms with how this has happened to us. And I suppose the two things I would say is, first, you have to take immediate first aid action. And usually that starts by saying, I have an injury. And then, as I say, if you were to search on religious trauma, there are now psychologists and psychiatrists and spiritual directors and others who have this specialty. But then the other thing I would say is, when you're ready, you may find out that the best solution to religious trauma is a kind of spiritual healing, rather than deciding that religion is the problem and you just want to be done with anything religious or spiritual. You may never feel that way, but you may. And if you do, I would just say, yeah, I see an awful lot of people in that situation. There's that old saying about the cat who sat on a hot stove, and he never sat on a hot stove again, but he also never sat on a cold stove again either.
Yeah.
and I think and I'm thinking of that, I guess, because your cat was just visiting us there, John. But it's understandable that many of us just want to get as far away as we can, especially if we've been wounded. And I don't want to put any other pressure on people who need to get away. But for the rest of us, we might find out that there is something valuable that needs to be rediscovered, represented to the world, that takes into account all the damage done by the religious industrial complex.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Brian. And I know you have a busy day. So this is Brian McLaren, publication day for Do I Stay Christian? You need to go buy the book. I Am First and Last a Book Salesman. So go buy Brian's book. But so you have a busy day. I'm going to let you go soon. I have one more question, and it's kind of a big one. At least for me. Answer it for me. Why are you such an optimist? I mean, I deal with these things also professionally and personally in many ways, and I wake up optimistic sometimes, but I often don't. And it strikes me that this is one of your gifts. This is one of your spiritual gifts. Gifts to the rest of us is your optimism. Why? You could easily look at all of this data and not be an optimist.
Yeah, well, I'm sort of pleasantly surprised to hear you say that, because I don't feel like an optimist. I feel like I I feel like whatever hope I had, I lost. But I feel like I'm beginning to discover a different kind of hope. And the way I have said it is that I used to think that hope depended on looking for positive trend lines and putting my attention on the positive trend lines, and those positive trend lines would keep me going. But I've lost that kind of hope. Now I think hope is discerning what the right thing to do is, and having a sense that I have a life well lived if I devote my life to what's good, whatever the trend lines. And I don't know if that's communicating or not, but that to me, it might sound like a small difference, but it's a huge difference. I'm not even sure I could have understood that difference 30 years ago, but it's something I feel deep in my bones. You know, writing this book helped me with this too, because there, as you know, John, there are 2 or 3 sections in the book where I do these big historical surveys. I talk about this very, very dark time, and then this better time that came after it, and this very kind of extinction events, and then biological evolutionary flowerings. And I wanted to trace those patterns out. And as you know, it's easy to write a sweeping couple of paragraphs about history that are very bad history. So I really went back and immersed myself in some of that history and made sure I wasn't just making something up. And what I realized is let's take the period of witch burnings. I talk about witch burnings in the book. It was one of the things that I felt I needed to look at again. And of course, I wrote this before we entered a political period that looks like The Handmaid's Tale. It was almost like a prophetic, possibility. But when I looked at the witch burnings, I asked myself, in 1590 or 1610, if I had been convinced that witch burnings were horrible, and I decided to speak up against them, but if somebody could go back and tell me it's not going to stop for well over 100 years, till long after you're dead, it's not going to stop, would I have said, I'm going to devote my life to this, I'm going to take risks, I'm going to suffer, but I'm not going to be complicit in this, even though I know in my lifetime I'll never see success? And that to me is the kind of hope that has become more and more precious to me. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. And thank you to everyone who joined us. This is Off the Page, where we talk with important authors of important new books at spiritualityandpractice.com. And this is publication day of Brian McLaren's Do I Stay Christian, an important book for many of us. Brian, you have a busy day. Good luck to you with the book. Thanks for taking time with us.
It's a delight to see you again, John. So great to be with everybody. Thanks for your questions and your interest. And yeah, what a pleasure to be with you. I look forward to seeing how the conversation unfolds. Thank you.
Thank you. All righty. Goodbye, everyone.